Urban Maestras Rising,
where bi-weekly we will be covering topics centered on educating BIPOC students as BIPOC educators born and bred in NYC.
We welcome parents, allies, and educators to be part of our community of listeners.
If you are ready to take the next steps into these needed conversations,
then you've come to the right place.
We are your hosts,
Jackie
and Jazz.
So welcome everyone. Today we are on episode 2 and our topic is the importance of the census.
Okay, so in our first episode, we ended off the conversation with a call in for everyone to complete the census. And the reason why we found that it related to our first episode where we introduced ourselves is because the way we identify and representation matters.
Amen, girl. So basically, we believe that in educating and elevating BIPOC students, we find it very important to explore the importance of the census. So what we're going to do today is we're going to unpack the process of the census. This way we're providing information to give access to all of our listeners.
So we can start off with what is the census? It's a confidential survey taken every 10 years by a nonpartisan entity known as the Census Bureau. And its purpose is to gauge the population and assist in allocating funding accordingly. And as we mentioned in episode 1, Title 13 of the U.S. Code, state that the census cannot release info about you, your home, or your business to any law enforcement agency. Therefore, it is super important for everyone to be accounted for in the census.
Thinking about this topic, we wanted to discuss how does a census feed into race as a social construct? Because race is a social construct. It's something that was created to put people that are not white into categories.
Right. So when we talk about race, usually, and this actually, the definition evolved due to the census and this whole process of having to self-identify. And race initially was something that was based on your phenotype or what you look like. Do you look white or do you look black? But then other groups such as Native Americans and Hispanic or Latinos and the Asian community, they weren't necessarily incorporated in that binary system of black or white. And so oftentimes you'll see that forms have ethnicities or nationalities when referring to where people are from.
So race, ethnicity, and nationality are 3 different things. So as Jazz explained, race focuses on physical characteristics, but ethnicity is cultural characteristics or like your heritage and anything that makes up culture that's all part of what your ethnicity is. And then nationality, this one actually can change. Nationality is where you were born or what country you become a citizen of. So if you move to another country and you decide to change your citizenship permanently, then your nationality can change. So I'm going to use myself as an example. So my nationality is American because I was born here and this is where I am living and this is where I am a citizen. My ethnicity, though, is Salvadorian because that's where my entire family is from. Both of my parents were born there, and all my ancestry traces back to that. And then race, that's where it gets tricky, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah. So Hispanics tend to switch their race or write something else like other. And based on this Center for Research, the Pew Research Center, they found that the largest number of those who changed their race or ethnicity category were 2.5 million Americans who said they were Hispanic or some other race. That was back in 2000. But then in 2010, they showed that another 1.3 million people changed their identity in the other way. They switched. Yeah, so there was a change from non-Hispanic white to Hispanic white or the other way around. So that was another change that they noticed within that 1.3 million switch in 2010. So I thought that was interesting to talk about.
Could it be that one of the reasons why Latinos decided to identify as white Hispanics versus non-white Hispanics is because of the power and privilege that comes with that identification? It's something to consider. Right, because we know that the census is used to allocate funding. And if people are representing themselves as white versus not, this can affect where money goes. Especially like when I was filling out the census, I was thinking about different factors. Like now that I can put down more than one race, but does it benefit our community to put down more than one race? So specifically in the census for a single individual like me takes you about 10 minutes to complete because it's 9 questions or so. And questions 8 and 9 are specific to either question 8 is about being Hispanic, Latino, or of Spanish origin, and then question 9 refers specifically to race. Just to unpack a little bit about Hispanic, Latin, or Spanish origin, Hispanic is inclusive of Spanish-speaking countries and Spain. Latin refers to Latin American countries, and that could include countries that speak Spanish, French, or Portuguese. And then Spanish origin talks about the country Spain. And those are all things that are represented in question 8, if you're from that origin. But question 8 also breaks down Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin a bit more. It talks about whether, yes, you're Mexican, yes, you're Puerto Rican, yes, you're Cuban, and then it incorporates everyone else separately. Okay, and it asks you to write in where you're from. For example, if you're Dominican, if you're Colombian, Guatemalan. So it gives you the space to write it in. And then for question 9, it talks about the race. And it says, and this is the newness of it, it says mark one or more boxes and print origins. So they want to know where you're coming from. So the first category is white, and they give certain examples. They talk about German, Irish, English, Italian, Lebanese, and Egyptian, which, Jackie, if you want to speak on like how you found that Egyptian.
Well, I just think it's interesting, and also like I want to know the reason why Egyptian was included in that category, which leads me to having to do more research behind that, because I'm sure there's something history behind it I don't know about.
But phenotypically, Egyptians, they're dark. So I don't understand how they're giving some examples and creating these categories where typically you wouldn't recognize those people as being white per se, or they're not treated as such in society.
Yeah, and then the next category, right, is Black or African American, and then they give examples.
Right, they talk about Jamaican, Haitians, Nigerians, Ethiopians. So it's like, for me, it's a bit difficult to differentiate Egyptians from like someone like an Ethiopian. So no longer is race a social construct where it's very easy to create a binary system and say you're white, you're Black. Now the lines are sort of grayed. And in thinking so, it made me think that yes, I recognize that I would most accurately or scientifically be considered 2 races, and I could identify that on the census now, but systemically, what are my usual experiences? And for the most part, I am categorized as a Black woman. I can even talk about like in my positions of leadership, sometimes I'm told that I might be a little bit aggressive in my approach, or I need to watch my tone. And that's not something that I don't feel comfortable checking off white in that instance because it's not indicative of my experience. What is indicative of my experience is those detrimental stereotypes of the angry Black woman used as a tactic to deflect from the messaging and for people not to hold themselves accountable.
Right. And also like, and then the third category, right under the race question, it says American Indian or Alaska Native. So if they didn't have the examples, I would have been like, what? But then they give examples of a print name of enrolled or principal tribes. For example, Navajo Nation, Blackfeet Tribe, Mayan, Aztec, Native Village, and it keeps on going. And for me, when I filled this out, I checked off American Indian because yes, I am a light-skinned Latina, where in some spaces I am passing, but I do have indigenous blood and indigenous roots, so I would check off that as my race, even though I am also half of my colonizer's blood. So it would benefit my community if I check off American Indian instead.
I see what you're saying. Like right now, we are currently only at a 50% rate of completion for the census, and that's in general for everyone. And historically, BIPOC communities, they have a tendency to be undercounted, especially in areas such as Central Harlem and Washington Heights. I think their percentage is closer in the 30s range. And given the fact that by 2045, white people will no longer be the majority and most people will be of mixed backgrounds, the census projects that 50% will be multiracial and close to 25% will be Hispanic. It's super important not to necessarily identify as white, but more to identify either in a more nuanced way where you're incorporating that you're both white and Black, or that you have a Native American background, but not to just like what that census data that Jackie mentioned indicates that a lot of people went more for saying that they were white Hispanics.
Right. And also, like, speaking of communities of color, the next like categories, which we found, like, we were also like had many questions about in this race question on the census. So first is white, and then they gave those examples, and the next option is Black or African American, then American Indian, Alaska Native, and then there's 11 boxes that they're all separate: Chinese, Vietnamese, Native Hawaiian, Filipino, Korean. So we found it interesting how all of those races or ethnicities there are ethnicities. They were broken down in that sense under the race question. And then there's a last one that says check off some other race. So I can see how in 2000 and 2010, a lot of like Hispanics didn't know what to do and probably just checked off some other race, because I do remember it wasn't as specific under the American Indian, Alaska Native category where they included all those indigenous communities. So I can see how if there weren't all these sub examples, I can see how someone who's not sure what race they are, ethnicity, identity, because it is very, very confusing document to begin with. Like, it doesn't align with the definition of race, the way they broke it down. Because as we said before, race is
either Black or white. So it's based on basically your appearances. So although you're self-identifying, it's really the way that other people see you. And I've had the experience where they come up to me and they say, do you know Spanish? So I know that I'm not white passing. Also, in thinking about the importance of filling out the census and improperly identifying, because even with Jackie's example of how the categories in that race question break down into Chinese and ethnic groups, easily someone could put in the other category Dominican, when really they should either be identifying as white, Black, or a combination of both, or incorporating their Native American status. But the reason why this is so important is because this data is used to ensure equal opportunities. So it creates funding for housing, voting, schools, employment, and things like affirmative action that came about because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, where they were closely monitoring equal employment opportunities and trying to rectify those wrongs of the past and giving people of color access to opportunities, in this case, jobs.
Yeah. I do want to mention as well that I feel like as a I like to identify as Latina and not so much Hispanic for my own reasons, right? I don't want to identify with the colonizing group, because Spain is included in the Hispanic label, but then Latina, Latino, Latinx includes like it's much more general,
and it's geographic too.
Right. So as a Latina, I can see how the Latinx community will be confused, because we are a mix of a bunch of things, like there's a mix of white, there's a mix of indigenous, there's a mix of Black in our DNA, and even in our features. So I can see how this one question that, as I'm going to mention again, is not aligned with the definition of race, but they broke it down where they're including ethnicity as well. So just reiterating the importance of thinking about what you're going to check off, and how is it going to benefit your community.
Right. And so when we get to the importance of the census in general, and this is according to the Population Reference Bureau's website, one of the main reasons why the census matters so much is apportionment. So when it comes to the US House of Representatives, seats are allocated depending on the population. So there are 435 seats and they're split up across 50 states. And so let's say, for example, a state like California has 53 representatives because it has so many, it has a large population. And so the more representatives you have, that equates to more money for your state.
Right. And also it's broken, that representation in the House of Representatives is two parts, right?
So Congress is two parts. Congress is made up of the House of Representatives and then the US Senators, which is 2 per state. That's a fixed number, but where there's leeway to play around with, or at least to get representation or increase those numbers, is in the House of Representatives.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So we're gonna give you 6 reasons why the census is important. So the second reason why the census is important is because of redistricting. And basically, based on the information they collect from the census, the congressional, state, and local district boundaries are redrawn in order to keep an equal number of people in each district. So this will meet the one person, one vote rule.
Okay. And the third reason, when it comes to money to states and localities, it helps determine the amount of funding that state governments and local communities receive from the federal government for the next decade. So this is huge because this data funds special education grants to states, the national school lunch programs, and things like Head Start.
And even Medicaid too.
Yeah, and highway planning and also construction.
The fourth reason is planning. So the information that is used from the census, they collect that information to make decisions on what to plan for. So for example, building new roads, hospitals, schools, and other like public sector investments.
Fifth reason has to do with emergency response. So depending on the amount of people counted, first responders and disaster recovery personnel, and it's really about finding out what places need it most.
And then the sixth reason why the census is important is this information is used to generalize the count of the population. And that way the federal government and federal surveys use that information to
project future population.
And housing, like the amount of housing we do have or might need. So if you want to like just look at the 6 reasons that we found from the Population Reference Bureau website, we actually have it posted on our Instagram page. So if you want to like forward that to your friends, it has been translated as well. So it's in English and Spanish. Feel free to go ahead and share that with your friends and family and community. So there's an article on the website Teaching Tolerance, and it's a very informative website. But there's an article called The Census Counts, What Your School Community Needs to Know About the Census. And I really, really enjoyed reading that article because it had a few things that I think is worth mentioning and worth reading about. For example, it gave you examples of how families can be sure participating in the census is safe. It also talked about the communities where students live that are least likely to respond to the census. And then it gave us 5 reasons or 5 different communities it gave us 5 different reasons why certain people won't complete the census. So it was titled, Who is the Most Likely to Be Undercounted This Year? So the first reason was immigrants. The second one is people who distrust the federal government. The third one is people without internet access. The fourth is linguistically isolated families. So even though the census is translated to multiple languages, there's still some languages that it hasn't been translated into. And then the fifth reason Any families that are experiencing homelessness or don't have like a permanent address are most likely not going to complete the census. So we're going to include the link to this article in the details below, so you can check it out and feel free to read up on it and also share with friends, family, and anybody else in the community.
Absolutely. And please note that as in most episodes, we included our opinion and our opinions differ from that of our listeners. We ask that moving forward, a protocol community of listeners and we can embody is to call people in instead of calling them out or condemning them for the beliefs or actions they engage in. So calling ourselves in, what does that look like? It's sitting with ourselves, reflecting on how we can personally do better in all facets of our lives. So really having a conversation, getting people to understand our points of view, and accepting and respecting the points of views of others.
Yes, and also like our understanding that our views and perspectives are evolving. So that means that it can change, after contemplating and researching things. So as part of calling ourselves in, our next steps for you are, and for everyone in our listening community, one, complete the census. And if you did complete it, there's ways to get involved. You can join the census phone banks, check in with other friends and family members to make sure they completed the census. You can spread the word, posting it on social media. We're going to be posting some templates that you can like reshare with your family members and community members on your social media account. Oh, you can reshare the reasons why it's important to complete the census. That way, and like I said, we have it translated in 2 languages. So check out our IG page, because that's where we have the reasons the census is important in both languages, and we'll also be posting just ways to spread the word about completing the census. Please remember that the census deadline, the last day to complete this, is September 30th, 2020. This is 1 month earlier than years before. So just please make sure you complete the census, because our representation matters. Yeah. So we're going to include our IG page in the description box below as well. And we are also going to be including our website. We just finished our website. So we're going to be posting information, and we will be linking that as well in our description box.
So thank you for listening to our podcast, Urban Maestras Rising.
Follow us on our Instagram account, Urban Maestra Rising.
Please remember to share, like, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Hit the bell icon for notifications to stay up to date with our episodes.
Goodbye.
Bye.